I remember that night more clearly than most days of my life. The kind of night that doesn't feel dramatic at the time, just tired, ordinary, and a little too quiet inside your own head. The plane had been in the air for hours. The lights were dimmed, people were half asleep, and I was pretending to read a book I couldn't concentrate on. Then it started, the crying. At first, it was faint, muffled by the hum of the engines. But soon, it filled the whole cabin, the kind of crying that comes from a child who doesn't just need sleep, but comfort. A cry that pulls something out of you, even if you don't want to notice. I turned slightly in my seat and saw him, a man holding his baby, bouncing her gently, whispering things I couldn't hear. He looked exhausted, almost fragile, like someone who hadn't rested in years. The baby kept wailing. He tried bottles, toys, even walked the aisle a few times. Nothing helped. I could feel the passengers growing restless, the sighs, the looks, the little movements of irritation. I don't know what made me react. Maybe habit, maybe instinct. Maybe the memory of my mother's voice, or how it used to fill our house before silence became our only language. I remember setting my book aside, closing my eyes, and letting a sound escape me, a quiet hum at first, almost shy. Then words. The lullaby. It was the same song my mother used to sing when I couldn't sleep after she and my father fought downstairs. I hadn't sung it in years. My voice trembled at first, but the melody found its way. Simple, slow, nothing special, just soft enough to thread through the cabin air. I didn't look up until the baby's crying stopped. Just like that. Silence. I felt it before I saw it, the stillness in the air, the shift from discomfort to peace. The man froze too, then looked around as if searching for what changed. His eyes found mine. We didn't speak, but something passed between us, that strange recognition when two strangers share a moment they can't explain. I smiled, just a small one, and kept humming. The baby's head rested against his chest, tiny fingers curled into his shirt. I remember thinking how fragile they both looked. Him, holding his whole world in his arms, terrified of breaking it. Her, trusting that no matter what happened, he'd keep her safe. The woman next to me whispered, "You're a miracle worker." I smiled again, but inside I felt something heavier. Because that lullaby wasn't for them, not really. It was for me. For the child I used to be, the one who never got sung to sleep again after my mother passed away. For the silence that followed her. When the flight attendants walked by, they smiled too, probably relieved the noise had stopped. But all I could think about was how quickly peace can return to a place, how sound can carry warmth, even when it comes from a stranger. I didn't plan to talk to him. I didn't even expect him to notice me again. When the plane landed, I assumed that would be it, another fleeting encounter in a life full of brief, unremarkable ones. But before I left, I saw him again in the aisle. The baby was sleeping now, her tiny face peaceful against his shoulder. He looked at me with quiet gratitude. "Thank you," he said softly. "You saved us tonight." I shook my head. I didn't do anything. But he smiled, like he knew I didn't believe that. Then he handed me something, a folded note. He didn't wait for me to open it. Just adjusted the blanket around his daughter, gave me a small nod, and disappeared into the slow shuffle of passengers leaving the plane. I didn't open the note until I was inside the terminal, sitting alone near a window where the first traces of morning light spilled across the floor. The handwriting was neat but unsteady, like someone who'd written it quickly, afraid he might change his mind. It said, "Thank you for singing my daughter to sleep in the dark. GW." That was all. No name, no number. Just initials and a line that stayed in my head long after the paper had been folded again. I watched him through the glass as he walked toward the taxis outside, still carrying his child, moving slowly, like the weight of her was both anchor and reason. I wondered about him, about the story behind those tired eyes. I wondered what kind of man travels alone with an infant and carries that kind of silence with him. I could have asked. But I didn't. Some moments are meant to stay incomplete, they're more beautiful that way. On my way home, I found myself humming again, the same tune, only quieter. I didn't know that simple act, one song sung in the dark, would follow me into places I'd never been, or that it would connect me to a life that looked nothing like mine. That night, I thought I'd only calmed a crying child. But looking back now, I think I was the one who stopped crying first. I didn't expect to see him again. People pass through our lives all the time, Airports, trains, crowded streets, and most of them never return. I thought he'd be one of those. A kind moment between two strangers, folded away like a page you never read again. But life has its own quiet ways of circling back. A week later, I was back at the bookstore. The same dull rhythm, unpacking boxes, sorting titles no one asked for, smiling at customers who rarely smiled back. It was safe there, predictable. I liked that. After my mother passed, I learned to build small worlds around quiet things. A cup of tea. A good story. An evening with no surprises. That morning was slow. The rain had started early, brushing against the windows like it wanted to be heard. I was rearranging a display when the bell over the door chimed. I didn't look up at first. People came and went all day. But then I heard a voice, soft, careful. "Excuse me, do you have anything by Margaret Atwood?" When I turned, I saw him, the man from the plane. The same tired eyes, though a little clearer now. His daughter was asleep in a stroller beside him, tiny fingers still clenched like she was holding on to a dream. For a second, I didn't know what to say. He smiled awkwardly, as if unsure I'd recognize him. "We met on a flight," he said. I nodded, still surprised. "You're the father with the crying baby." He laughed under his breath. "That's one way to remember me." Something about his tone eased the stiffness in the air. I showed him where the Atwood books were. He picked one up, glanced at the cover, and said, "You have a good voice. That lullaby, it stayed with her. She still hums it in her sleep sometimes." I didn't know how to respond to that. Compliments about my voice always felt misplaced, like they belonged to someone else. "I'm glad she's okay," I said quietly. He hesitated, then reached into his coat pocket. "I wasn't sure you'd even read the note," he said. "But I wanted to say thank you again, properly." "I did," I told him. "You already said enough." He looked down, maybe to avoid the weight of the silence between us. Then he added, "My name's Graham." It was the first time I heard it. Just a simple name, but there was something steady about it. I told him mine, Linda, and somehow that small exchange made the air lighter. We talked for a while, nothing personal, just books and weather and how coffee in rain always tastes better. Before he left, he asked if I'd mind if they stopped by again sometime. I said sure, thinking he probably wouldn't. But he did. Once a week at first. Then more often. Always with Ava, the little girl with the softest eyes I'd ever seen. She'd giggle when I'd read to her, grab my hair, or fall asleep on my shoulder without hesitation. There was something peaceful about her presence, something that made even the emptiest afternoons feel full. Graham never talked much about himself. I didn't ask. But there were traces of a story around him, a ring mark on his finger, a photograph he once dropped of a woman smiling in sunlight, a kind of quiet grief that sat beside him like a shadow. I could feel it, though he never named it. Sometimes, after he left, I'd think about that night on the plane, how small decisions find ways to change everything. If I hadn't sung that lullaby, he might have just been another face. But now, he was a part of my days, not romantic, not dramatic, just constant. It felt good, in a way I hadn't felt in years. Like I was slowly remembering what kindness sounded like when it came without expectation. He'd bring coffee sometimes, or a new book for the store, or stories about how Ava was learning to say book instead of boo. And I'd laugh, something I didn't do often. Still, there were moments when I'd catch him staring into nothing, lost in thoughts he never voiced. Once, while I was shelving a book, he said quietly, "I used to think peace was something you had to earn. But maybe it's something you borrow, from people who still believe in it." I didn't answer. I just nodded, because I understood. Sometimes peace isn't a destination, it's a moment someone lends you until you can find your own. When he left that day, I watched him through the rain, pushing the stroller with one hand and holding a book in the other. Something about the way he moved, gentle but certain, stayed with me. I didn't know who he really was, not yet. Didn't know how different our worlds were, or how soon they'd remind me of it. All I knew was that the man I once helped on a plane had quietly become the calmest part of my week. And for the first time in years, I didn't feel like a background character in my own life. People think peace feels like silence. It doesn't. It feels like the hum of a cafe when you're not expected to speak. It feels like the sound of a child's laughter echoing between bookshelves. It feels like being seen, softly, without questions. That's what my days with Graham and Ava had become. A soft hum I didn't want to disturb. Weeks turned into months. They'd visit the bookstore every Friday. I'd brew an extra cup of tea without even realizing I was doing it. Ava had grown braver. Now she'd run to the children's corner the moment they arrived, clutching the same storybook she loved the most. And Graham would follow quietly, smiling in that slow, uncertain way that always seemed to carry gratitude. He told me once, while we restocked a shelf together, "You know, this place feels like a pause button." I smiled. A pause from what? He looked at the floor before answering. From pretending everything's fine. He said it so casually that it almost slipped past me. But that's the thing about quiet people. Their truths are often hidden in throwaway sentences. After that day, I started noticing more. The late hours he kept. The dark circles that no amount of coffee could hide. The way his phone would ring, and he'd turn it face down on the counter, ignoring it completely. I didn't ask. It wasn't my place. But sometimes, the way he'd look at Ava, that fierce, protective kind of love, told me he was holding something together with his bare hands. One evening, after we closed the shop, I found a letter wedged between the pages of a book he'd bought. It wasn't addressed to me, but curiosity won. It wasn't long, just a few lines, written in a woman's handwriting. "Graham, this isn't what we promised. I need you to choose. You can't be both father and ghost. Not like this." I stared at the note for a long time, my heart beating faster than it should have. Was it from his wife? Someone else? It wasn't my business. I told myself that over and over. But that night, when I closed my eyes, her words stayed, "You can't be both father and ghost." The next Friday, he didn't come. Nor the one after that. The store felt emptier than it should have. I caught myself glancing at the door every time the bell chimed, expecting them. It was ridiculous. He was just a friend, a passing soul. But I had grown used to that calm his presence brought. By the third week, I stopped pretending I wasn't waiting. And then, he returned. But something had changed. He looked thinner, his eyes darker, like he'd spent nights chasing things he couldn't catch. Ava was quieter too, clinging to his coat instead of running to me. "Everything okay?" I asked softly. He hesitated, then nodded. "Just life," he said. But his voice didn't sound like it belonged to the same man. I wanted to reach out, to tell him he didn't have to carry whatever it was alone. But what right did I have? We were two people bound by coincidence, not promises. Still, I couldn't ignore the way he kept looking out the window, as if expecting someone to appear. That evening, before leaving, he turned to me. "Linda, do you ever feel like you owe someone a version of yourself you no longer recognize?" The question cut deeper than I expected. I could have lied, said no, or brushed it off. But I didn't. "Yes," I said. "All the time." He smiled faintly, like my honesty gave him permission to breathe. "Then I guess we're both ghosts trying to find our way back." After he left, I stood in the empty shop for a long while, thinking about that. Ghosts trying to find their way back. Maybe that's what grief really is, not just losing someone, but losing yourself in the process. Over the next few days, he stopped by again, not to talk, not even to stay long, just to sit for a while Ava colored by the counter. He didn't say much, and I didn't push. Sometimes, silence is the only language pain understands. But I could feel it, something was unraveling. Slowly, quietly. One night, just before closing, I saw him standing outside the shop in the rain. He wasn't holding an umbrella, wasn't moving. Just standing there, drenched. I stepped outside. "Graham." He looked up, eyes red, voice trembling. "I'm sorry. For disappearing. You don't owe me." "I do," he interrupted. "You were the first person who looked at me and didn't see a mistake." The words hit hard. He wasn't talking about the plane anymore. He wasn't talking about small kindness. Before I could reply, Ava's soft voice came from behind him. "Daddy, cold." He turned, picked her up, and whispered, "I know, sweetheart." Then he looked back at me. "Thank you, for giving her a place that feels safe." And just like that, he left again, fading into the night like a line that ends mid-sentence. I stood there long after they were gone, rain soaking through my coat, wondering if some people were meant to drift in and out of your life, not to stay, but to remind you that even broken things can still bring warmth. It was a Tuesday, the kind of day that passes quietly, unnoticed. The shop had been empty most of the afternoon. I was restocking shelves, humming under my breath, when the doorbell chimed. It was almost closing time. I looked up, half expecting to see Graham. But it wasn't him. The woman who walked in looked out of place. Impeccably dressed. Composed in a way that felt practiced. She carried herself like someone used to being in control. Still, there was something tired in her eyes, something that didn't match the rest of her. "Are you Linda?" she asked. Her tone was polite, but her question carried weight. The kind that makes you straighten your back without realizing it. "I am," I said. "Can I help you?" She looked around the store, like she was searching for something that wasn't there. "I was told this is where he comes." I didn't have to ask who he was. My silence must have told her enough. "He hasn't been home in days," she continued. "And he won't answer my calls." I thought maybe, she gestured vaguely at the shelves, maybe you'd seen him. I hesitated. "He came by last week. With Ava." Her expression flickered. Guilt, maybe relief, maybe both. "Then at least I know he's okay." She sighed, steadying herself. "I'm Claire. His sister." Something in me softened. I nodded slowly, though my guard stayed up. We talked for a few minutes, carefully, like two people trying not to step on glass. She didn't say much about why she was looking for him, only that things had gotten complicated. The kind of phrase people use when the truth is too heavy to explain. Before she left, she asked quietly, "Do you believe people can save each other?" The question caught me off guard. I didn't answer right away. "I think," I said finally, "sometimes all we can do is give them a reason to try." She smiled faintly, a tired, grateful smile. That sounds like something he'd say. Then she turned and walked out into the rain. I didn't realize I was shaking until the door closed behind her. That night, I couldn't sleep. My mind kept circling back to her words, her tone, the way she'd looked at me, not accusing, not angry. Just searching for a piece of someone she'd lost long before she came here. And beneath all of that, there was another feeling, fear. Because I'd let myself care. About a man I barely knew. About his child, his quiet sadness, his small moments of peace in my shop. And now, someone from his real life had appeared, a reminder that he belonged to a world I wasn't part of. The next morning, I found a note slipped under the bookstore door. The handwriting was familiar. "Thank you, for seeing me when I was invisible. I'm leaving town for a while. Tell Ava's story when she's older. Tell her there was light even in the storm." It wasn't signed, but it didn't have to be. I read it over and over, the words blurring until they stopped meaning anything. Then I sat behind the counter, the note in my hand, and for the first time in years, I cried. Not out of heartbreak, but out of something harder to name. That strange in-between of loss and understanding. When you've lived long enough, you realize that not every connection is meant to last. Some exist only to bring you back to yourself. To remind you that empathy doesn't always lead to love, sometimes it just teaches you how to stay open after everything else has closed. 4 days, I went through the motions, unlocking the store, brewing tea, helping customers. But my mind wasn't there. It was with that letter, and the memory of a man who found comfort in silence. One evening, just as I was turning the sign to closed, I noticed something, a small child's mitten on the floor near the counter. Ava's. I picked it up and held it for a long time, thumb tracing the tiny stitched heart on the palm. It's strange how ordinary objects can hold so much ache. A week later, Claire returned. This time, she looked different, calmer, lighter somehow. "He called," she said softly. "His, taking time to heal. Somewhere quiet." I nodded. Relief and sadness mixed in my chest like smoke and air. Before leaving, she placed an envelope on the counter. "He asked me to give you this." Inside was a photograph, Ava holding a seashell to her ear, sunlight spilling across her face. On the back, written in his neat handwriting. "Some silences are worth keeping. Thank you for teaching me that." I didn't realize I was smiling until I saw my reflection in the shop window. It wasn't joy. It wasn't sorrow. It was something quieter. Peace, maybe. The kind that comes when you stop waiting for answers. That night, I closed the store early and sat in the dark, the photo resting beside a cold cup of tea. For the first time in a long while, the silence didn't hurt. It just was. Time has a strange way of moving when someone leaves. At first, it crawls, heavy, unwilling. Then one day you look up, and months have gone by, quietly, without permission. The bookstore didn't change much. I kept everything where it was, even the small chair Ava used to sit on, her coloring pencils still in the drawer. Customers came and went, faces blurred into one another. But sometimes, when the evening light fell through the window just right, I'd see their shadows there, Graham's tall, tired frame, Ava's tiny laugh floating through the aisles. And every time I dusted the shelf by the corner window, my hand would stop at the empty space, the book he never returned. It wasn't valuable. Just an old copy of The Little Prince. The cover was worn, the pages faintly smelled of sea air, like it had traveled farther than either of us ever did. But somehow, that missing book became a kind of presence. He'd once told me, some books aren't meant to be borrowed. They find their readers and stay. I didn't understand what he meant back then. Now, I think I do. It's strange how you start building small rituals around someone's absence. I'd brew 2 cups of tea even when I was alone. One would go cold. I'd restock children's books slower than I needed to. And sometimes, when closing up, I'd whisper a quiet goodnight into the empty air, not expecting anyone to hear it, but needing to say it anyway. Life, though, doesn't pause for long. One evening, a young couple came into the store, newlyweds, judging by their nervous sweetness. They spent an hour picking books for their soon-to-be-born child. When they left, the woman smiled and said, "This place feels warm. Like someone loved it before we came." Her words stayed with me. Because she was right, love leaves residue. Even when it's unspoken. Even when it ends. That night, I sat by the counter and looked through the letters Graham had left behind, 2 of them now, the first one still creased from how many times I'd unfolded it. His handwriting was neat but heavy, like each word had been weighed before it was written. "You told me once that silence isn't emptiness, it's space for things to grow." I didn't understand then. I do now. Thank you for giving me space to become someone my daughter can look up to. There was no return address, no hint of where he was. But somehow, I didn't need one anymore. Because what mattered wasn't whether he'd come back, it was that he'd found peace somewhere, somehow. And maybe, in some quiet way, I had too. Still, some days the ache returned, sudden and unreasonable. I'd see a father lifting his child in the street, or hear a lullaby playing faintly from someone's phone, and it would all come rushing back. But instead of breaking me, it softened me. It made me gentler with people. More patient. More present. One afternoon, while rearranging the front display, I found something wedged behind the counter, a folded receipt, old and yellowed. The date was months ago. The book listed on it, The Little Prince. His name scribbled at the bottom in that same careful handwriting. I smiled, despite the sting in my chest. Maybe he'd meant for it to stay. A reminder that some stories aren't meant to close neatly, they're meant to linger. As the sun set, I stepped outside and locked the door. The street was quiet, the air heavy with the scent of rain. I looked up at the darkening sky and thought about how people, like books, leave different kinds of endings. Some tragic. Some unfinished. And some, simply open, waiting for another reader to turn the next page. When I got home, I placed a copy of The Little Prince on my bedside table, my own copy this time. I opened it to the first page and began reading aloud, softly, to no one. "It is only with the heart that one can see rightly, what is essential is invisible to the eye." The words sank deeper than they ever had before. Maybe Graham had been right. Some books stay. And maybe, so do some people, just not in the way we expect. The next morning, when I unlocked the store, I noticed a postcard tucked under the door. It was from a coastal town, no name, no message, just a photograph of the sea at dawn. I turned it over. On the back, a single sentence written in faded ink. "She still hums the lullaby." For a long time, I just stood there, holding that card against my chest, smiling through tears I didn't try to hide. The book he never returned wasn't missing anymore. It had just found its way home, through a silence that spoke louder than words ever could. I never believed life could circle back this way. Months had passed since that flight, since the night a crying child made me sing again. He and I had crossed paths a few times after that, at the bookstore, in the park, at a small cafe where he'd bring his daughter, and I'd bring a book I never really read. He wasn't the man I'd once imagined someone like me could ever know. A billionaire, yes, but beneath all that, just a father trying to rebuild something fragile. Every time we met, the conversations grew longer, the silences softer. His daughter, little Emily, had started calling me Lynn. I never corrected her. One evening, as the sun slipped behind the city skyline, he said quietly, "You changed the sound of my home, Linda." I smiled, not knowing what to say. He reached for my hand, gentle, unsure, almost afraid. I don't want to rush what peace feels like, but I don't want to lose it either. There wasn't a grand proposal. No fancy setting. Just the two of us standing in the calm we'd both fought to find. When we finally married, it was small, a quiet ceremony in a garden filled with white flowers and evening light. No cameras, no crowd. Just his daughter holding my hand and whispering, "Sing the lullaby again." And so I did. This time, not to calm a crying child, but to remind us how far we'd come from that night in the dark cabin. Love didn't come to me like a storybook ending. It came like forgiveness, slow, gentle, and true. If you enjoyed this story, hit like, follow, and share your opinion in the comments.